Hey everyone, I just got back from the Ahmanson Theatre here in Los Angeles, which sounds really weird to say because I'm so used to saying in London's West End at this point. But not today. I was at the Ahmanson and I got to see a soldier's play. To be specific, I won the lottery on TodayTix, so I only paid $20 for the tickets. I was row double B, which is the second row, and the seats were glorious. So I was going in, having been to the Ahmanson before, I saw, was it Hadestown or the Lehman trilogy there last year? I can't remember, one of the two, but I remember really liking the theatre, and that whole sort of complex is just really nice. It's really open plan, and it's a really good experience going to it, in my experience. So I sit down in my seat, right, and I'm ready to have a good time. I'm excited, I'm comfortable, my view is fantastic, but I know nothing about the show that I'm about to see. I do this pretty often, actually, when I go to the theatre, that there's plenty of stuff that I've just never come across in my life to date. I've not been a big theatre fan for a particularly long time, I don't think. And so when there's something new that I'm not super familiar with, like recently seeing A Streetcar Named Desire, I might know it exists, but I see no reason to look it up and look into it before the show. So I went in with no expectations and no knowledge. And I think that gives me a somewhat unique perspective on things because it's not like I studied this in school. It's not like I've seen a bunch of other people's commentary or analysis on the play itself. And nor did I know what kind of play it was even going to be. It turns out that A Soldier's Play really is a murder mystery, which completely blew me away. I had no idea that that was going to happen because my only assumption going in was, well, it's about soldiers and we're in America, so they might lean into the whole patriotism thing. That's going to feel real weird because I'm a Brit. But no, this was a murder mystery that also I thought wasn't going to have any music in it, but it ended up having quite a lot of music, which I really loved. In fact, the opening of the show is musical instantly. You have the house lights dim and it all fades to black, and then all of the soldiers who are the main characters of the play come onto stage in the dark, establish a couple of different positions on beds, you can hardly see them, and then they start singing. And it starts with just one guy and he's singing, and then the others join in, and it gets percussive, and they're stomping their feet and they're slapping their hands on the stage, and there's a light that grows in the center of them, and so their backs are illuminated. And you have one of the soldiers, and he's lit up a little bit more clearly than the others, and he's sort of shimmying on top of the bed, while the others are all doing this percussive slapping and chanting and singing, and it's rousing, and it's inspirational, and it's also haunting in many ways. And as a beginning of a show, I mean, they don't get much better than that. I had a really lovely opening 5 minutes just drinking in that scene. And then you had the classic moment, which I'm starting to feel like is a pretty common experience in regional theatre in America. I don't know about the UK because I've not really done a lot of regional theatre outside of London. But there's a moment in the opening few minutes of the show where there's a character who's stumbling around and they basically are killed. And the common experience that I'm referring to here is the audience members out loud exclaiming when that happened. I don't know. There's an aspect of performative audience participation here that seems to be happening over and over again. I had it happen just 1 week ago when I saw Let the Right One In San Francisco. It happened again here multiple times through the show, but most prominently in this early moment because this guy's killed and the woman behind me goes, "Oh shoot, look at that." I'm already looking at it, babe. It's right, like it's right there. Why? Thankfully, though, that was a one-off. We'll talk more about the Let the Right One In stuff when I do my review of that in a couple of days. But to get back to the core of this review, the story begins and you're basically introduced pretty early to this character, Captain Davenport, played by Norm Lewis. And Davenport is tasked with investigating who has killed the character that died right at the start of the show. His name is Sergeant Waters, and he's played by Eugene Lee. Now, Eugene Lee is 70 years old, and he is perfectly cast for this show. I actually need to check because I hadn't noted this down. Who was the casting? Jim Carnahan. Free programs, God bless. Jim Carnahan, you have really done a wonderful job in making sure that you gave Eugene Lee a role in this show because he was so good, and it's a really nice full circle moment because Eugene Lee actually originated the role of one of the other characters, Corporal Cobb, in the original 1981 off-Broadway production of this show. So the fact that he's back now and playing an even more central role is awesome. He is just so good in the part. He's got this stature to him, this grumble in the way that he speaks, and this jadedness about the world that is so well performed and I thought was fantastic. And this isn't to say that the other folks in the cast didn't do a great job. I'm going to move on to that in just a second, but I just really wanted to especially call out Eugene Lee because he's getting kicked around during the show as well. Like multiple moments. He's punched, he's kicked, he's shoved to the ground, he's risen from the ground and then shoved again, like over and over again. And this is a 70-year-old man, and he's taking it like a champ. And there is not a single moment where you doubt his physicality. There isn't a single moment where you go, ooh, they're being nice with him because he's old. No, sir. He is rough and ready and raring to go and keeps this hatred almost, this self-hatred in many ways, and this hatred of the people around him and the resentment that he holds inside himself, and wears it on his face and on his shoulder, chip on his shoulder at all times. Fantastic. I loved his performance. Norm Lewis was fine. I think Norm Lewis had one key moment where he got to flex his singing muscles a little bit, and it was really lovely. His voice is beautiful. This is my first time ever seeing him live. And I kind of wish somehow that he'd had more opportunities to sing, but I think that's just going to have to happen in a different show. But his performance of his character, Davenport, was an unusual one for me. I enjoyed it. I thought it was great. But there are moments where the military aspect of things, the fact that he's carrying himself with military stature, did mean that he felt a little robotic, maybe. And I think that this is a choice he's made. I don't think this is a flaw that is like a hole in his acting, but rather it's the way that he's developed the character. Because Davenport very much is trying to carry out this investigation in the face of an apparatus and a machine around him which categorically does not want him to do his job. He's been given orders to find the perpetrators of this killing, but if the perpetrators of the killing are white, the system doesn't want to know about it. And so he's got to butt up against that. And as part of that, as a black man in America during the Second World War, he's constantly facing up also to individual acts of racism and just perpetuated systemic prejudice in society that were, and I hesitate to say it with these words, but more normal back then. And what I mean by that is they would have been more common as a daily aspect of his life. And as such, this character, Davenport, would totally have built up walls in order to be able to deal with those people and to remain professional and not get baited into their racism and their goading and their prejudice. Like he would, I'm sure, find his own ways to cope and deal with that. So I'm not saying for a second that his portrayal wouldn't have been an accurate representation of the sort of person that Davenport would have had to be, but I do wish that there'd just been a little more looseness to his tone, the way he spoke maybe, or something, just to maybe humanize him a little bit more than he was in the show, because in the show he is so reserved and within himself because he's put on this professional mask in order to get the job done. Not really a gripe with Norm's portrayal though, just I think that I would have loved to see a version of the character developed differently, but I can just see that at another show another time. There are two other call-outs to specific people in the cast that I want to mention here, and don't get me wrong, I thought they were all great, but Malik Isoj Childs, who plays Private Tony Smalls, he had the most absurd amount of liquid coming out of his face at the end of the show, and it was awe-inspiring. How can an actor convince their snot to escape their nostrils on command? How does an actor do that? Okay, I'm being a little facetious. I'm sure that he wasn't trying to will that into existence, but it was remarkable because you could tell he was so deep in the role, and this is a moment in the show, I won't spoil things, but this is a moment in the show where there's sort of a revelation happening and it's very intense. And tears are one thing, but just the way that his face like crumpled in on itself, and he had snot hanging from his nose and saliva that was everywhere, and he was sweating, and it led to this awful picture of a completely broken man, like 100%. He was reduced to being a toddler and had no shame or sense of embarrassment or anything. I mean, all this was going on. He didn't wipe it once. It was swinging around. He didn't wipe it once. He was just too broken to do so. And I thought his performance throughout the show was great, but especially it really culminated at the end there. And I was like, damn, this guy's giving literally everything he has to this, and I respect the hell out of it. I will say there was one moment at the very beginning of the show where the soldiers are interrogated to see if any one of them might have perpetrated this killing. And there was something in Malik's performance, and I don't want to be too specific here because I don't want to be spoilery, but there was something in his performance that revealed something that would happen later, and it meant that the entire time I was looking at him going, yeah, I've already seen this. Like, I already know this. And that's a difficult one because, on the one hand, that means he was acting it really well, but on the other hand, I would have almost liked for him to act it less well, so I had less clues as to what was happening until we got deeper into the show. Again, it's not a criticism, it's just sort of an observation that it's funny how these things work in theatre, I suppose. The last call out to specific cast members I want to give is to Sheldon D. Brown, who played Private CJ Memphis. And this was an interesting performance because Sheldon is a jacked, really tall, really powerful looking man, but he's playing the meek, musical, kind of airheaded Private Memphis who has a really tragic story through the show. You grow to love him very quickly, but there's a lot of sadness associated with his character arc. And he especially has quite a lot of focus in the beginning of Act 2. And I wasn't sure at the beginning of the show if Sheldon, the actor playing him, maybe had some form of maybe Tourette's or something similar. I couldn't be sure, but he had mannerisms that he was displaying through the show that were just really unique. And at first, again, I was like, okay, I'm not sure if that's just Sheldon or if that's the character that he's playing or what. So at the end of the show, I was like, oh, I want to learn more about who this guy is. I'm really interested. Turns out I watched an interview with him from about a year ago for a short film that he worked on. And Sheldon, a couple of years ago now, was hit in a drive-by shooting in Chicago and couldn't walk for months, had all sorts of like bags and things to just help him live with his kidneys, etc. And he fought through all that, survived, found a way to creatively express some of the things that he'd been living with through that film that he'd worked on. I think it was called Cicada. And then said in this interview, like, I really want to get back on stage and do some more stage work. And here he is today. And I just thought it was really wonderful that this man had gone through something so traumatic and so tragic. And in this interview I watched with him said, you have to find ways to keep moving in spite of the trauma. And he clearly, as far as I was concerned, was personifying this trauma and reliving this trauma in many ways in his depiction of CJ in the show today. And so all of the contortion of his body and this real look of woundedness at all times, this smile that was almost too happy, like it was a smile that was fixed there and held in a grip that wasn't his own. It was a look of real possession almost at certain moments. And I can't help but feel like that was really inspired by a lot of the pain and the suffering that he's gone through in his own life and that he brought to the stage in a really wonderful and cathartic way, I hope at least for him, on stage today. So I want to call out his performance as being especially good. I think there is a world where I would have seen that and gone, ooh, he's trying to look like he's got some kind of condition, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I think in this instance, it wasn't that he was trying to convey that sense of otherness, but rather he was, or at least I hope, trying to convey some of the feeling that he has had inside him this whole time, since that horrible thing happened to him, and finding its own way to release. And so I see his performance as a triumph today, and something that I really wanted to commend. Now, I mentioned that there was music in the show. There is music sort of sprinkled throughout the entire thing, because the soldiers will sing for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and they'll drum up this really lovely, haunting melody, and it's often very percussive as well, because, for example, there are 4 beds on stage pretty much through the whole show, not quite the whole thing, but a lot of it. But on occasion, they are pushed to the back of the stage by 4 of the soldiers, so an office scene can be constructed in the front half of the stage. And when this would happen, they'd be singing, and especially Malik, who I mentioned before, who played Private Smalls, he would have this wonderful movement to him where they'd be singing and pushing these beds, and he'd go into these deep, deep lunges and slam his foot down, and it was just really mesmerizing to watch, even so small a movement that lasted maximum 5 seconds. And I really appreciated that. I really liked that as part of the show today. And so the set would sort of transform into an office a little bit. They would have these wooden shutters kind of swing in from the sides, and then they would swing back out again. There was a walkway in the back, and there was a massive wooden sheet behind that, and it was really nice. It looked wonderful. It wasn't particularly complex in terms of set pieces or movement. There was never a moment where they had any kind of surprise revolve or surprise element that would roll on other than a desk. There wasn't really anything, as I recall, that raised or lowered, no fly action. So it was a reasonably static set, I would say. And similarly, the lighting design was not particularly flashy. It was very simplistic, I'd say, with a few moments that were very tastefully executed. For example, there are lots of flashbacks during the show, and they did a good job of illuminating the right people at the right times in colors and tones that felt like it conveyed accurately that feeling of stepping back in time while also being pulled back into the present by that present-day narrator that is still there in the room. And speaking of the show being maybe a little stripped back or somewhat on the simplistic side in terms of their choices, there was also no band. The only music that we got was the crew themselves, the soldiers themselves. It was Norm doing his little bit of singing as well. And then right at the end, there was a choice that was made, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, because the show is very much rooted in the past. It's rooted in the Second World War. There are absolutely elements of the social commentary in the show that we'll talk about in a moment that I think are absolutely still essential to be talked about today and worth examination continuously. But the show ended with this kind of solemn moment, I suppose, where you learn of the outcome of the lives of all of these soldiers. And then they begin the bows, and a song that I think, I Shazammed it, I think it was a Nipsey Hussle song, starts playing over the speakers while they do the bows. And it was a choice. It was a real jolt from past to present and from one style to another, and I don't know, I just found it a little jarring. And it's not that I don't think that Nipsey Hussle's music would convey the message that they're trying to get at the end of the show there. And I'm also not saying that I don't understand why they would introduce Nipsey Hussle in a moment where they're trying to talk about all these difficulties of racism and questions of self-hatred within your own race, and the difficulty and the struggle that comes from that, and the loss that comes from that, and how that's perpetuated, but also spurred on by this larger structure around you that puts you in these positions. Like, I get it, but at the same time, in a show where there's been no music whatsoever of the speakers, and then we suddenly have Nipsey Hussle blaring out at the end, I don't know. Personally, I don't think I liked it, but maybe for some people that was a really evocative moment. I'm not really sure. It just felt a bit slapped on. So let's talk about some of the social commentary in the show. The theme, which I believe the playwright's name is Charles Fuller, has really gone for here is examining, like I just said, the way that when there are systemic problems in society, such as a huge amount of racism towards black people, those problems can cause black people looking for answers and looking for reasons why this great injustice could be happening, to think to themselves, well, this is so irrational and this makes so little sense that I'm going to try and rationalize it by conjuring up my own more controllable reasons for why it's the case. And so in the case of Eugene Lee's character, Sergeant Waters, he feels that certain black people are a kind of letdown to other black people and that they hold black people back. And it's their fault that white people treat black people the way that they do. And so Waters in the show is very much looking out at all times for any signs of weakness that he sees from his fellow black men. Because when they fight back against him and when he gives them some trouble and they resist it, he sees that actually as a sign of strength because it's a sign of status and of pride and almost of class. Whereas when they don't fight back against him, he sees it as a weakness and something that the white people that are in power at this time are going to exploit. So it's anchored very much around this feeling of, well, if they're treating us this way, it must be because some of us are doing something wrong. And it's easier for me to control those fellow men in my unit who share my skin color and force them to do the right thing, in my view, than it is to take on the much wider problem, the larger problem, and the problem that is also so ungrappleable with. It's completely impossibly large. Like, you can't just take on systemic racism as one man, right? So there's an element, I think, of sympathy that you are supposed to feel for Waters, because Waters, at the end of the show, is mentioned to have been commended as one of the first African-American men to die in battle for the United States. I believe that was more or less the words that they used. And so there's an aspect of commending his memory there, I think, while at the same time recognizing that he was perpetuating the problem in his own way in his attempts to resist against it. And so the sympathy comes from the fact that he was at least really trying, and he might not have had the solution, but back then, nobody did. During the Second World War, nobody did. So I like the fact that he was a complex character. I like the fact that he was written the way he was. He was dynamic. He had multiple sides to him. He had multiple motives, but you really felt like there was a core DNA that informed the way he acted at all times. He felt really complete. And this went for pretty much all the men in the unit, actually. I really liked their character development, and reflecting on it more now, I think that it's very easy in a show like this, especially when it's soldiers involved, because it's easy to use a soldier as like a blank canvas that you slap some kind of stereotype on top and call them a character. So I think it's easy for them to feel like they are nothing more than the generic parts of them that belong to certain identities or whatever. And you see this all the time. Every single time there's like a war movie and there's a group of soldiers, one of them's like one thing, one of them's from another place, one of them likes another thing, one of them's married to another thing, and it's just like, okay, guys, we get it. Well done. You've created different characters. But in this, it didn't feel like they'd been created. It felt like they were. And I really loved that, and I think Fuller did a fantastic job in creating this play in the first place, in just making this feel like life in many ways. And there were moments of comedy in there. That's not to say that it was a pure, sort of singular, emotionless window into the reality of war or anything like that. Like, there's a moment where there's one private, I think, who is just really excited by the fact that there is a black commanding officer now. And so he walks off the stage and he comes back and he's almost giddy with excitement and he really wants to salute to his commanding officer. And it was a nice moment, and the audience certainly liked it. And on stage, it felt really fun. And so those moments are threaded in as well. It's not a devoid of joy. And I think that that's really important in a show like this, which is trying to be so introspective and to dig into problems societally that are perpetuated by white people, but also that sweep up black people like Sergeant Waters and that cause all of their own problems. That was all there, but there were still moments of jollity and jovial kind of expressions of happiness and excitement and hope for the future. And I loved that. I really enjoyed and respected the fact that they still managed to find ways to fit those in without breaking the tone of the wider show. So overall, I had a really great time today. I actually really loved seeing this show in a way that I did not expect. I'll give it 4 stars. I think the things missing for it to get to a 5 from me is just that it felt a little predictable, and when it's a murder mystery and you can see exactly where it's going, it feels like some of the point of the medium is lost. And I also just felt like they could have maybe had some aspect of slightly more exciting and thrilling set or lighting or something, just to push it into sort of perfection territory. But still, it's a really strong 4 for me. I had a great time, and coming from someone that historically has not had fantastic experiences in theaters in the US, excluding Broadway, I've never been, but I've seen quite a lot of shows in LA before and just not always had a great time for whatever reason. And this one has blown all of those past experiences out of the water. I had a great time, and I really wish the best to all of the crew and the creatives that worked so hard on this. And I implore you to go see it if you have a chance. Go on to Datix, enter the lottery. I promise it's easy to win tickets. I did it the first time I entered. So good luck. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.